Do you think you truly know the people around you? You believe you can identify when someone is toxic, when an energy is heavy, when a behavior crosses the line of what is acceptable. But what if I told you that the real dangers are not obvious? That the most destructive people are often charming, kind, even family members. And that while you try to protect yourself from the obvious villains, you are opening the doors of your mind to something infinitely more dangerous, the unconscious of others invading your own. Carl Gustav Jung dedicated his life to studying these hidden dynamics. In his seminal works, such as The Ego and the Unconscious and Psychological Types, he reveals that most of what truly governs us is not under our conscious control. This applies not just to you, it applies to everyone. And that is precisely where the danger lies, because when someone is blind to their own darkness, that shadow, that unacknowledged part of their psyche, seeks a host. And often that host is you. Perhaps you have never stopped to think about this, but think now. How many times have you felt emotionally drained, inexplicably exhausted after talking to someone? How many times have you found yourself blamed for something you didn't do, or conversely elevated to the role of savior for a tragedy that wasn't even yours? Jung called this phenomenon projection, an unconscious defense mechanism where the other projects onto you what they refuse to see, acknowledge, or integrate within themselves. From that moment on, you cease to be a person in their eyes. You become a symbol, a mirror, an imaginary enemy, an idealized hero. And all these images have something in common. None of them is truly you. The most frightening part is that often you don't even realize you are ensnared in this psychological game. You think you are helping, that you are being empathetic, that you are demonstrating maturity by understanding their difficult behavior. Meanwhile, you are sinking into a psychological field that is not yours, trying to resolve conflicts that are not yours, being manipulated by dynamics that were not created by you, but now insidiously control you. And it's not just about ill-intentioned people. Jung made it clear the greatest dangers do not come from conscious perverts, but from unintegrated unconscious ones. They are those who live alienated from their own psyche, dominated by masks, traumas, complexes, and repressed desires. They are not necessarily evil in the conventional sense. They are, however, profoundly dangerous, and this danger is silent. It doesn't come barging through the front door with a declaration of war. It infiltrates slowly, daily, through small comments, veiled accusations, loaded silences, and subtle emotional demands until you start to doubt yourself, your perceptions, your very sanity. And when you lose contact with your own psychic reality, you risk becoming an extension of their shadow. In this exploration, we will expose one by one 10 types of people whom Jungian psychology would identify as emotionally dangerous, types that act not with deliberate malice but with internal forces they themselves do not understand and often deny, and that is precisely why they are so destructive. We will use Jung's concepts and warnings, drawing from the wellspring of his life's work, to show you how to recognize these profiles. But more than that, we aim to open your eyes to the unsettling possibility that perhaps, just perhaps, one or more of these profiles or fragments of them reside within you as well. Are you ready? Then take a deep breath and move forward. But be warned, after internalizing this, you will no longer be able to look at people or even at yourself in the same way. 1. The eternal child. Have you ever encountered someone who seems to drift through life, exuding a captivating charm and an aura of boundless potential, yet never quite landing anywhere concrete? They flit from one exciting prospect to another, a new job, a new relationship, a new spiritual path. But commitment, responsibility, and the mundane realities of adult life seem to elude them. This is the realm of the eternal child. Jung and his successor, Marie-Louise von Franz, who wrote extensively on the Puer Aeternus for males and Puella Aeterna for females, describe this as an archetype of an individual who remains psychologically adolescent, refusing to embrace the burdens and limitations of adulthood. They can be incredibly creative, inspiring, and full of life, often possessing a Peter Pan-like refusal to grow up. Their world is one of possibilities of what-ifs and some days. However, this comes at a significant cost. Their fear of being pinned down, of making choices that close off other options, of facing failure or simple drudgery, leads to a pattern of unreliability and a profound lack of follow-through. They might expect others, a partner, parents, friends, to take care of the practicalities, to provide a safety net, or to clean up the messes left by their impulsive decisions. The danger lies in their subtle, often unconscious draining of resources, not just financial, but emotional and temporal. You might find yourself constantly making excuses for them picking up the pieces or investing hope in a potential that never materializes. Their charm can be disarming, making it difficult to hold them accountable. Living with or being deeply involved with an eternal child means constantly battling disappointment, feeling the weight of their unshouldered responsibilities, and realizing that the stability you crave may always be just out of reach, sacrificed on the altar of their perpetual youth. They are not malicious, but their inability to ground themselves creates a vortex of instability for those around them. The one possessed by an unintegrated anima, Animus. Imagine a man plagued by inexplicable moods, sudden bouts of hypersensitivity, or irrational jealousies that seem to arise from nowhere. Or picture a woman whose opinions are delivered with an almost aggressive certainty, often based on unexamined assumptions, and who is prone to argumentative know-it-all pronouncements. Here we encounter the individual possessed by an unintegrated anima or animus. In Jungian psychology, the anima is the unconscious feminine aspect of a man's psyche, and the animus is the unconscious masculine aspect of a woman's psyche. These are vital contrasexual archetypes that, when integrated, contribute to wholeness, empathy, and creativity. However, when these aspects remain largely unconscious and undeveloped, they can possess the individual, leading to distorted perceptions and problematic behaviors. A man with an unintegrated or negative anima might be moody, overly emotional in an uncontrolled way, prone to projecting idealized images of the goddess or devalued images of the whore onto real women, leading to inevitable disappointment and conflict. When reality doesn't match his internal fantasy, he might be easily offended, his feelings like an exposed nerve. Conversely, a woman with an unintegrated or negative animus might appear opinionated to the point of dogmatism, her masculine assertiveness manifesting as a tendency to lay down the law with unshakable, often stereotypical convictions. She might engage in power struggles, be overly critical, or deliver pronouncements that are more like collective, unthought-out prejudices than reasoned arguments. Interacting with someone in the grip of a negative anima/animus can feel like you're not dealing with the person themselves, but with a shadowy, autonomous entity. You might find yourself constantly defending against their projections or battling a barrage of emotional or intellectual truths that have little basis in shared reality, making genuine connection and mutual understanding incredibly difficult. 3. The psychic vampire. Some people don't merely want your presence, your company, or your affection. They want your energy, and they will often unconsciously do everything in their power to drain it from you, not with overt violence nor with explicit aggression, but through a relentless campaign of subtle demands, chronic victimhood, and an emotional dependency, camouflaged as affection or need. This is the psychic vampire, arguably one of the most silent and insidious forms of emotional draining that Jungian psychology warns against, even if not always by that specific popular term. In Jungian language, this dynamic often points to an unresolved symbiotic relationship, a pathological bond that actively hinders psychic growth and dissolves the contours of the individual self, preventing individuation. Jung, in various passages, particularly when discussing the mother complex or dependent relationships, highlights how individuals unable to psychically sustain themselves can latch onto others like emotional parasites. The psychic vampire lives precisely in this type of connection. They need your constant attention, your daily comfort, your perpetual availability. Their conversations often revolve around their problems, their anxieties, their unmet needs, with little reciprocal interest in your own life. You start by offering support, genuine empathy, then you find yourself giving more and more of your time, your emotional labor. You might tolerate emotional outbursts, constant negativity, or manipulative guilt-tripping, all in the name of understanding or helping. Before long, you realize that your own energy reserves are depleted, your boundaries eroded. You feel exhausted, not just physically, but existentially. A profound weariness that sleep doesn't cure. It feels as if your very soul is being devoured, drop by drop, day after day. The psychic vampire doesn't want to grow, they want to be carried. And the danger isn't just in the exhaustion, it's in the insidious dissolution of your own self, as you become increasingly defined by their needs and their dramas. The inflated ego, the narcissistic projector. Consider the individual who must always be the center of attention, whose stories invariably revolve around their own achievements or perceived slights, who seems constitutionally incapable of deep, genuine empathy for the struggles of others, unless it somehow reflects back on them. This is the domain of the inflated ego, often manifesting as what contemporary psychology might term narcissistic traits, but viewed through a Jungian lens of archetypal dynamics and psychic imbalance. According to Jung, an inflated ego is often a compensatory mechanism, a defense against profound, often unconscious feelings of inadequacy or inferiority. To ward off these terrifying feelings, the ego inflates, puffing itself up with an artificial sense of grandeur, specialness, or superiority, but it lacks a solid, authentic foundation. These individuals are masterful at projection. They project their desired grandiosity onto situations, expecting special treatment and admiration. When faced with their own shortcomings or failures, which are unbearable to their inflated self-image, they are quick to project blame, incompetence, or malice onto others. People in their orbit are often used as mirrors to reflect back their desired image of brilliance, or as scapegoats to carry the burden of their unacknowledged flaws. Interacting with someone dominated by an inflated ego can be an exercise in frustration and self-negation. Your own needs, feelings, and accomplishments are likely to be minimized or ignored. You might feel exploited, devalued, or constantly manipulated to prop up their fragile sense of self. Genuine connection is elusive as the relationship is primarily one-sided, designed to serve the insatiable needs of their ego. The danger lies in the slow erosion of your own self-worth, as you are subtly or not so subtly trained to see yourself as less important, less capable, or somehow responsible for their emotional equilibrium. 5. The bearer of the persona. Not all psychological danger manifests in overt aggression or extreme behaviors. Sometimes it arrives in a guise of almost unnerving perfection. The ever-ready smile, the impeccable posture, the flawless public image, the person who always says and does the right thing. We live in an era that often values appearance over substance, where seeming can eclipse being. For Jung, this was a serious psychological concern, because when an individual identifies too closely, too exclusively with their persona, the social mask we all wear to navigate the world and fulfill social roles, they risk a complete and dangerous disconnection from their authentic self, their soul. In 2 essays on analytical psychology, Jung describes the persona as a compromise between individual and society as to what a man should appear to be. In itself, the persona is not a mistake. It's a necessary functional complex. The problem begins when someone believes they are only that mask, when the mask adheres so tightly to the face that everything spontaneous, vulnerable, raw, and authentic is locked away in the psyche's basement, becoming part of the repressed shadow. The bearer of the persona is a master of functional superficiality. They navigate social situations with aplomb, avoid conflict at all costs, as conflict might crack the facade and say what others want to hear. But behind this curtain of control, Jung would argue there is often an impoverished inner world, a soul in ruins. The more energy invested in maintaining the image, the more the true self is suffocated. And this repression, sooner or later, exacts its price, often in the form of neurosis, unexplained anxiety, or a sudden shocking breakdown of the carefully constructed facade. For those who live or work closely with such a person, the impact is profound. You sense that something is amiss, a lack of depth, truth, or genuine spontaneity in your interactions. Everything can feel rehearsed. Worse, the bearer of the persona often projects this demand for perfection onto you as well. They expect you to perform, to fit in, to collaborate with their theater of appearances. If you express something outside the script, an intense emotion, a doubt, a pain, they may retreat, become visibly uncomfortable, or shut down, because anything that reminds them of what is repressed within themselves becomes unbearable. Coexisting with a bearer of the persona is not just artificial. Jung warned it's contagious, potentially leading you to adopt your own false front. 6. The moral controller. Not every executioner carries a visible sword. Some wield crosses, rule books, dogmas, and ready-made pronouncements of judgment. They are those individuals who claim to be driven by unimpeachable ethics, righteousness, and a higher morality, often positioning themselves as guardians of virtue. But deep down, Jung would suggest they are often imprisoning themselves and others within a rigid cage built from guilt, shame, and unexamined condemnations. Jung was acutely aware of this archetype. For him, when morality is used as a facade, particularly one that denies its own shadow, it becomes one of the most insidious forms of psychic repression and control. This is the hallmark of the moral controller. This individual, instead of confronting and integrating their own shadow aspects, their own sinful thoughts, desires, and imperfections, projects them onto the behavior of others. They then condemn those others for the very things they cannot accept or acknowledge within themselves. You have certainly encountered such a person, quick to point fingers, to diagnose the moral failings of everyone else, but rarely, if ever, turning that critical gaze inward. They position themselves as a reference for behavior, not because they genuinely embody balanced virtue, but because they desperately need to maintain an image of moral superiority to keep their own repressed darkness at bay. According to Jung, the greater the internal repression, the more intense the need to project the shadow externally. The moral controller transforms others into sinners, deviants, or immoral beings to avoid facing their own desires, impulses, and contradictions. Unlike a common emotional manipulator who might be aware of their tactics, the moral controller often genuinely believes they are doing good. They think they are correcting, saving, or educating the other. This conviction makes their influence even more toxic because it is cloaked in an aura of authority, good intentions, and sometimes a false or rigid spirituality. Their criticisms come swaddled in phrases like, "It's for your own good," "You'll thank me later," or "Someone needs to tell you the truth." But this truth is not neutral. It is laden with their unacknowledged projections. Living close to such a person can lead you to feel constantly guilty. judged and diminished as if you are always falling short of an impossible externally imposed ideal. 7. The owner of the repressed shadow. There is a type of person who lives a highly controlled, polished, restrained existence. Always correct, always moderate, always polite, or so it seems. They strive for lightness, for perfection, for an image of unblemished goodness. But behind this meticulously constructed veneer of balance lies a volatile force, a darkness about to break free, because everything they consider wrong, ugly, unacceptable, or inferior within themselves is not overcome, not integrated, not transformed. It is simply pushed down violently, repressed into the basement of the soul. This is the essence of the owner of the repressed shadow. Carl Jung dedicated a significant portion of his work to understanding the shadow. In Ion Researches into the Phenomenology of the Self, he states, "The shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality, for no one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort. To become conscious of it involves recognizing the dark aspects of the personality as present and real. The shadow is everything the individual refuses to acknowledge in themselves, yet it insists on manifesting in some way. It is the hatred you don't admit to feeling, the envy. You rationalize the ambition you disguise as humility, the sexuality you repress. Whatever you reject in yourself does not disappear. It festers and transforms into shadow material. And as Jung taught, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." The owner of the repressed shadow may not seem dangerous at first glance. On the contrary, they are often admired, disciplined, kind, helpful. But there's something brittle about them. They often cannot tolerate perceived weakness or imperfection in others, as it mirrors their own denied parts. They may react poorly to spontaneity or intense emotional displays in others. They always seem charged, holding something back, but never quite exploding until they do. And when that explosion happens, perhaps triggered by a seemingly minor incident, it is often devastatingly out of proportion, revealing the immense pressure of the repressed contents. Jung was clear: the stronger and more perfect the persona, the darker and more repressed the shadow. And the more repressed the shadow, the more brutal, primitive, or unexpected its eventual eruption will be, either in sudden outbursts, passive-aggressive sabotage, or chronic, inexplicable bitterness and resentment. 8. The rigid dogmatist. Do you know someone who clings to rules, traditions, or a specific set of beliefs with an iron grip, utterly resistant to new information, alternative perspectives, or any form of change? They may criticize new ideas with disdain or dismiss those who don't conform to their proven way of doing things. Here we encounter the rigid dogmatist, which can be understood as a manifestation of the negative aspect of the Senex archetype, the wise old man, woman. While the positive Senex embodies wisdom, experience, order, and considered judgment, the negative Senex manifests as rigidity, cynicism, fear of the new, and a tyrannical adherence to the letter of the law. Often, at the expense of its spirit, these individuals find their security in fixed structures, established procedures, and unshakable convictions. This rigidity often stems from a deep, unacknowledged fear, a fear of chaos, of the unknown, of losing control, or perhaps of their own inner world's unruliness. By imposing strict external order and dogmatic belief systems, they attempt to manage this internal anxiety. They may appear wise or authoritative, but their wisdom is often a closed loop, incapable of growth or adaptation. The danger of the rigid dogmatist lies in their capacity to stifle growth, creativity, and individuality in those around them. They can create an environment that is suffocating, where questioning is discouraged and conformity is prized above authentic exploration. Innovation is seen as a threat and spontaneity as a sign of indiscipline. For those under their influence, be it in a family, a workplace, or a community, the pressure to conform can be immense, leading to a repression of one's own insights and a fear of expressing dissenting opinions. Jung emphasized the importance of the psyche's dynamism and its need to evolve. The rigid dogmatist, by contrast, seeks to freeze time and a single narrow interpretation of reality. 9. The unconscious manipulator. Imagine living with someone who consistently blames you for everything they feel. Your presence becomes a trigger for their distress. Your actions or inactions are always the cause of their unhappiness, and you are subtly or overtly made to feel responsible for emotions you never intended to cause and which seem disproportionate to the situation. At first, they might seem fragile, sensitive, perhaps even profound in their emotional depth. But over time, you realize you are being inexorably dragged onto an emotional battlefield that isn't yours, a field where you are always at a disadvantage because the rules are unstated and constantly shifting. This is the unconscious manipulator. This individual is dominated by their own repressed content, unintegrated traumas, unprocessed emotional fragments, and deep-seated insecurities. Instead of looking inward to address these wounds, they unconsciously project them outward, primarily onto those closest to them. You become the canvas for their internal conflicts. According to Jung, projection is an inevitable function of the psyche, but if it remains unrecognized, it becomes destructive. In The Ego and the Unconscious, he elaborates on how projection causes a kind of psychic blindness, a prison, where the other ceases to be seen as they truly are and is instead used as a symbol of what is hidden and unacknowledged within the projector. The unconscious manipulator doesn't see you. They see a lost, rejected, or feared part of themselves, and they react to this projected image as if it were real. They often position themselves as victims. If they are angry, it's because you provoked them. If they are sad, it's because you disappointed them. If they feel inferior, it's because you are making them feel that way. This distortion is so insidious that you begin to question your own reality. Was I really insensitive? Did I say something wrong? Am I actually a toxic person? And thus the manipulation occurs without a shout being heard, without a direct request being made. It's all emotional, unconscious, and devastatingly effective because it preys on your empathy, your desire to be a good person, and your willingness to self-reflect. 10. The complex individual. Imagine navigating a relationship with someone who at one moment is sweet, affectionate, and generous, and in the next explodes in a rage over a trivial matter, shuts down in a wall of impenetrable silence, or accuses you of thoughts and intentions that never crossed your mind. A simple compliment can morph into a perceived demand. A lighthearted joke can become a vicious aggression. A gesture of affection can be interpreted as a threat. No matter what you do, it feels as though you are perpetually treading on unstable, booby-trapped ground. This is the hallmark experience of living alongside a person dominated by powerful unconscious complexes. For Jung, complexes are feeling-toned ideas, or autonomous nuclei of emotion, memory, and archetypal imagery that reside in the personal unconscious and can at any moment seize control of consciousness. They are like fragmented sub-personalities within us, often created by significant emotional experiences, particularly traumas, psychic wounds, and unresolved life challenges. In Psychological Types and Other Works, Jung describes how these complexes can directly interfere with an individual's behavior, causing them to react not to the present reality, but to echoes of a painful past. A simple comment, a particular tone of voice, or an innocent situation can unconsciously connect to an old wound of abandonment, rejection, humiliation, or betrayal, and those nearby pay the price for this triggered reactivation. The complexed individual rarely realizes they are being guided by these internal forces. When they react with disproportionate fury, extreme sadness, or exaggerated resentment, They genuinely believe their response is rational and justified by the current situation. But they are not truly present. They are in that moment reliving and reenacting undigested emotions from their past. The most bewildering aspect is that this doesn't happen consistently. It occurs in fits and starts. There are emotional explosions or implosions interspersed with moments of lucidity, genuine affection, or even profound regret. This inconsistency makes the bond with such a person even more confusing and paradoxically addictive. You start to think they are not always like this. Sometimes they are wonderful. And that is precisely what keeps you hooked, hoping to reclaim those good moments. In an attempt to restore harmony, you begin to mold yourself, adapt, shrink. You start to avoid certain topics, measure your words, walk on eggshells, all to avoid waking the monster that sleeps fitfully within the other person. But the brutal truth is that monster is not primarily awakened by you. It is always there, latent, hungry, waiting for any trigger, however slight, to emerge. The path to liberation, making the unconscious conscious. Jung offers us a profound, albeit challenging path out of this unconscious jungle to make the unconscious conscious. And this applies not only to understanding and navigating the difficult dynamics projected by others, but crucially to recognizing these same patterns within ourselves. Because perhaps at some point in your life, under certain pressures or in specific relationships, you too have been a psychic vampire, an unconscious manipulator, a bearer of a rigid persona, or someone possessed by an unintegrated complex. None of us is immune. We all have a shadow. We all carry pain and unfulfilled potentials. The difference lies in who has the courage to look within, to grapple with their own internal world, and who chooses, however unconsciously, to project that undigested weight onto others. This exploration was intended as a mirror, a dive into the often invisible dynamics that bind us, hurt us, and keep us locked in cycles of unconscious suffering. If you've journeyed this far, it signifies a readiness within you to see, to name, and ultimately to begin the process of freeing yourself. And this act of conscious recognition is the first and most powerful form of freedom. It is not about assigning blame to others in a simplistic way, but about stepping out of the position of psychological hostage, about reclaiming sovereignty over your own psyche, your own emotional reality. Now, I invite you to participate, reflect deeply. Which of these profiles have you encountered in your life? More uncomfortably, perhaps, which of these dynamics do you honestly perceive, even in nascent forms within yourself? Your honest reflection, even if shared only with yourself, can be the beginning of profound awareness and change. For you, and by extension for those whose lives you touch. The journey into the unconscious is ongoing, but the more light we bravely shed upon it, the less power it holds to control us from the shadows.